Think back to the first day of January, 1949. In the vast American West, the new year began with a cruel and beautiful deception. The air was unseasonably mild, and the skies over Nebraska, Wyoming, and the Dakotas were an innocent, deep blue. Ranchers went about their morning chores, enjoying the sun and completely unaware of the monster gathering on the horizon. But by the afternoon of January 2nd, the trap snapped shut with terrifying and violent speed. This wasn't just another winter storm. It was the beginning of the White Hurricane, a siege that would bury the West. History often remembers the middle of the 20th century as an era of post-war optimism, of booming industry, and of man's increasing dominance over nature. But in the High Plains, the year began not with a celebration of progress, but with a reminder of our fragility. It started on a Sunday. The barometer gave little warning to the layman's eye. The horizon showed no immediate threat. The West was calm, basking in a January thaw that felt almost like spring. Families drove miles across the open prairie to visit relatives for the holidays, lulled into a false sense of security by the gentle breeze. But nature turned on a dime. It began with the wind, a low moan rolling off the Rockies that quickly escalated into a scream, tearing across the flatlands at 70 miles per hour. And then the temperature crashed. It didn't just slide, it plummeted 40, then 50 degrees in a matter of hours. The rain turned to sleet, the sleet to snow, and then the world simply vanished. Within 24 hours, civilization in the West had been effectively erased. The snow didn't fall down. It was driven horizontally, like buckshot stripping paint from barns and blinding anyone foolish enough to step outside. This was the White Hurricane, a climatic siege that would grip the American West for weeks, turning the familiar landscape into a frozen, alien planet. Drifts began to pile up not just feet, but yards, 5 feet, 10 feet. Eventually, drifts of 30 feet would bury two-story farmhouses all the way to the chimney tops. For the ranchers of the plains, the situation shifted instantly from inconvenience to a battle for survival. The farmhouse, usually a place of refuge, became a fortress under siege. Windows shattered under the pressure of the wind. Snow forced its way through keyholes, under doors, and through the cracks in the floorboards, forming fine white dunes inside the living rooms. To step outside was to enter a whiteout so complete that it destroyed your sense of balance. There was no sky, no ground, only a suffocating whiteness. Farmers, desperate to reach their livestock in the barns just 50 yards away, had 2 tie ropes around their waists and secure them to the porch railing. They knew the stories of men who had stepped off their porch to fetch firewood, became disoriented in the swirling void, lost their sense of direction, and froze to death just feet from their own front doors. The isolation was total. Telephone lines, weighed down by ice as thick as a man's arm, snapped like dry twigs. The poles themselves were sheared off at the base, leaving wires buried deep under the drifts. One by one, the voices of the West were silenced. The party lines went dead. The electric grid failed. As the furnaces died, families huddled in their kitchens, the smallest and warmest rooms, feeding their wood stoves with anything that would burn. They burned fence posts. They burned their furniture. In some desperate cases, they burned the very corn they had harvested just to keep the frost from claiming their children. But it wasn't just the homesteaders who were trapped. Teblisad of 49 declared war on the greatest symbol of American industrial might. The railroad, the Union Pacific Line, the iron artery that connected the East to the West, was severed. In the high deserts of Wyoming, the snow didn't just drift. It packed into the cuts and valleys of the tracks until it was as hard as concrete. Trains that weighed hundreds of tons, engines that had pulled the weight of the war effort, slammed into these walls of white and stopped dead. The most famous casualty was the city of San Francisco, a luxury streamliner filled with passengers expecting a smooth journey across the continent. It became stranded near Kimberly, Nevada. For days the train sat motionless, a steel snake buried in the snow. Inside, a strange microcosm of society developed. The heating systems failed. The luxury dining cars ran out of steak and champagne. Passengers who had boarded as strangers, separated by class and ticket price, found themselves huddled together for warmth, wearing every piece of clothing they owned. Doctors on board tended to the sick, using improvised supplies. They played bridge with freezing fingers and rationed sandwiches, while outside, the wind howled, a constant, deafening reminder that no amount of money or engineering could outrun this storm. Eventually, rescuers had to reach them on sleds and weasels. It took days to dig them out, but for those on the train, it was merely an ordeal of discomfort. For the cattlemen of the plains, it was a tragedy of biblical proportions. The livestock industry, the economic backbone of the West, faced total annihilation. Millions of cattle and sheep were stranded in the open range. The wind had driven them miles from their pastures, pushing them into ravines where the snow simply swallowed them whole. Those that didn't suffocate were left standing on top of hard-packed drifts exposed to wind chills of 50 degrees below zero, with no access to food or water. Their eyes froze shut. Their breath turned to ice on their muzzles. Cattle have an instinct to drift with the wind. They walked until they hit fences, and then they huddled there, piling atop one another as the snow buried them. Ranchers, trapped in their homes, could hear the wind but could do nothing for their herds. They knew that, with every passing hour, their livelihood and the lives of the creatures they cared for were being extinguished. It was a slow-motion disaster that threatened to bankrupt an entire region. It was in this moment of despair that the federal government realized the scope of the disaster. This was no longer a weather event. It was a national emergency. President Harry Truman declared the region a disaster area, and then the roar of engines replaced the howl of the wind. The United States military launched Operation Haylift. It was a mission without precedent in peacetime. The Air Force and the National Guard mobilized a fleet of C-47 Skytrains and C-82 Packets, the flying boxcars. Their mission was not to drop bombs, but to drop life. They loaded bales of hay into the bellies of these massive aircraft. The flying conditions were treacherous. Pilots had to fly dangerously low, skimming just feet above the snowy peaks and buried telephone poles, navigating through blinding squalls and turbulence. In the back of the planes, young airmen, strapped in against the open cargo doors, kicked tons of hay out into the freezing air, aiming for the dark spots in the snow that marked the surviving herds. On-T-ground ranchers looked up with tears freezing on their cheeks. To them, those loud, rattling aircraft were nothing short of angels. Operation Haylift dropped thousands of tons of feed. It didn't save every animal, tons of thousands perished, but it saved the industry. It saved the West from total economic collapse. It was a testament to American logistics and the refusal to let nature have the final word. Yet, amidst the grand scale of military operations, the true story of 1949 is found in the quiet, stubborn resilience of the individuals. It is found in the story of the country doctors who attached skis to their cars, or who borrowed horse-drawn sleighs to reach women in labor, delivering blizzard babies by the light of kerosene lamps, while the storm raged outside. It is found in the ham radio operators, the amateur hobbyists, who became the only communication network for entire states. They stayed at their radios for 48 hours at a stretch, relaying messages from stranded families to rescue crews, coordinating airdrops, and simply providing a human voice in the terrifying silence. It is found in the small-town stores that opened their pantries to everyone, suspending the concept of debt, in the hotels that packed 10 strangers to a room because the roads were impassable, in the neighbors who formed human chains, holding hands to walk from house to barn, so that no one would be lost in the whiteout. This was the American spirit distilled to its essence. When the lights go out, you help your neighbor. For the children of 1949, the memory is different. It is a memory of magic, mixed with a menace. They remember waking up to find the upstairs windows covered in snow. They remember their fathers digging actual tunnels through the drifts just to get to the road. They remember sledding off the roof of the chicken coop because the snow was that high. They remember schools being closed for weeks, a suspension of reality where the rules of the world no longer applied. To a child, the white hurricane was an adventure. To their parents, it was a siege. But the storm was not a single event. It was a relentless series of blows. One blizzard followed another throughout January and February. There was no time to dig out before the next wave hit. The snow packed so hard that you could drive a Jeep over the top of a buried car and not know it was there. Road crews worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, their machines breaking against the ice. They used dynamite to blast through the drifts, creating canyons of snow with walls 20 feet high. When the thaw finally came, late in the spring, it brought its own destruction. The massive volume of snow turned into raging rivers, flooding the very lowlands that had been buried weeks before. The carcasses of the lost cattle were revealed as the snow receded, a grim accounting of the winter's toll. The cleanup took months. The economic recovery took years, but the psychological mark it left on the generation that endured it was permanent. The Great Blizzard of 1949 did more than just freeze the land. It froze a specific version of the American character in time. It was the last great battle of the pioneer spirit, before the interstate highway system and modern satellite forecasting changed the West forever. It was a time when technology failed, when the trains stopped, when the electricity died, and when the only thing that stood between a family and the void was a wood stove, a roots ajar, and the strength of their own will. Today, as we drive across the interstate highways of Wyoming and Nebraska at 70 miles an hour, listening to our podcasts and enjoying our climate control, it is hard to imagine that just beneath the asphalt lies the memory of a winter that conquered the world. We rely on our screens and our forecasts, believing we have tamed the elements, but the land remembers. If you stop in a small-town diner in the Dakotas or a ranch house in Wyoming and you ask an old-timer about 49, you will see a change in their expression. It is a look of respect, a look of memory. They will tell you about the wind that sounded like a freight train. They will tell you about the tunnel they dug to the barn. They will tell you about the plane that dropped hay from the sky. And they will tell you, with a quiet, solemn pride, that they survived the white hurricane. They survived the winter that buried the West, and in doing so, they learned exactly who they were. Because the storm stripped away everything that was unnecessary. It stripped away the vanity, the politics, and the social standing. It left only the essential elements of life: warmth, food, and the person standing next to you. And in the end, that is the lesson of 1949. That we are small, temporary creatures living on a wild and violent continent. But when the sky turns dark and the wind begins to howl, the American spirit does not break. It endures. It helps its neighbor. It ties a rope to the porch railing, grits its teeth, and walks out into the storm.